Good evening. My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a monthly town meeting that brings prominent New Yorkers together with faculty and students of the Edward T. Rogowski Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. It's said that those who love sausage and the law shouldn't see either being made, and that is especially true when it comes to redistricting. The quaint notion that voters should pick their representatives instead of their representatives picking their voters takes a beating every 10 years when state lawmakers set out to redraw district lines for Congress and for themselves after each census. First up this year were the congressional lines, which were complicated by the fact that we're losing 2 of the 29 seats we currently have in the House of Representatives. Legislators under pressure from upstate Republicans and downstate Democrats, especially minority elected officials and activists, ran through countless plans drawing districts that looked like Rorschach ink blots before a federal magistrate stepped in and took over the process. The result is a series of districts that have actually generated some very interesting races. Some of those races involve emerging ethnic communities, such as an attempt by Assemblywoman Grace Meng to become the city's first Asian American Congress member from a district in Queens, and Dominican-born State Senator Argiano Espaillat's challenge to long-term incumbent Charles Rangel in a district that is now majority Latino. I, as usual, have to declare my conflicts here. I am working with Congressman Rangel on his re-election campaign. State legislative redistricting is not even completed yet. The Republicans in the closely divided Senate decided to enhance their 32-30 majority by creating a 63rd seat that in its makeup favors the GOP. As of this taping, that move is still under review by the state's highest court and federal courts, but it appears to be legal to me, even if it's a bit sneaky. None of this came close to meeting the letter or the spirit of the agreement lawmakers signed with former Mayor Ed Koch's New York uprising, promising independent and transparent redistricting, closer to the system that New York City will use next year to come up with new districting lines for 51 city council seats. Governor Cuomo, after threatening to veto any redistricting plan that did not meet his own standards for transparency and independence, did no such thing. It all goes to underscore Michael Kinsley's dictum that the scandal is not what's illegal, the scandal is what's legal. We are joined by 4 New Yorkers who take part in the debates and maneuvering surrounding redistricting. Esmeralda Simmons is the executive director of the Medgar Center for Law and Social Justice. Lucia Gomez-Jimenez is the executive director of La Fuerte. Jerry Vattamala is a staff attorney with the Democracy Program for the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. And Andrew Beveridge is the president and CEO of Social Explorer and a professor in the Sociology Department at Queens College and the City University Graduate Center. Esmeralda, you've been at this for quite a time. You've been on districting commissions. What we saw in what's now the 13th district, the Rangel-Espaillat district, where they tried to draw 2 separate districts, one of which may have looked like the old Nydia Velázquez Bullwinkle district. They faced the problem of not having retrogression, that you couldn't have fewer votes, that you couldn't dilute minority votes. How did that factor in, and whether they drew the 2 lines and then the judge came in and drew 1 line?
Well, I'm going to say up front, they didn't draw any lines. There was a complete zilch. They abdicated their duty.
Meaning the
legislature drew nothing. They put nothing forward. They passed nothing. They gave nothing to the public. We had no public hearing. We never saw anything from them. So the federal court, urged on by groups like mine and All Deaf and Latino Justice and Las Fuente, went forward to the court and asked the court to draw the line. So now, when I say they, I mean the state legislature as a whole did nothing. That doesn't mean that individual legislators or groups were not proposing different maps. And the map you referred to, the one that went from Manhattan, swung up like an arch, it was almost like a sickle, and reached all the way into Westchester County.
That would have been the African-American dominated district.
Yes, that was the African-American dominated district that was trying to have the Bronx be the tail of a small part of Manhattan. They called it the Harlem district, but most of the district was in the Bronx. So there was a lot of infighting.
There was also a Latino district that was going to go somehow swing all the way around into Jackson Heights, wasn't there?
Yes, right. Thank you. Yes, there was. Well, some people call it Latino, But Lucia may want to speak on that one.
Yeah, those were just proposals by different sectors of people trying to protect political incumbency and not want to challenge one another. So I wouldn't say none of the advocacy groups, the civil rights groups, actually advocated for any of those kinds of districts. So when you talk about retrogression and whether or not the districts that we have now are retrogression, well, we propose those very districts that they have in place now. So voting rights groups and individuals that have been working on this for a long time did not feel or do not feel at this point that those districts that were actually drawn by the courts are retrogressive. So if you refer to District 13, I would probably argue that the districts being proposed by those individuals who were trying to protect political incumbency were in fact could have been retrogressive had they been put in place.
You've also seen in what's going on in Queens, you see a couple of things. You see a district which has kind of the largest concentration of Asian American voters that we've ever seen in a district in this city. And you see, on the political side, you see the Queens Democratic Organization doing what smart organizations have done in this city, which is to say, rather than have you challenge me, I'm going to bring you in. I'm going to kind of subvert you by dragging you into. And the Queens organization is supporting Grace Meng, who's trying to replace Gary Ackerman, even though the county leader's cousin is one of the candidates challenging Grace Meng. I mean, this is, we're seeing it with Senator Espaillat, we're seeing it with Grace Meng, this idea in New York City of firsts, that we're still dealing with the emergence of firsts.
Yeah, well, you know, Asian Americans have grown tremendously over the last decade, and there's over 1 million Asian Americans in New York City alone, and in Queens it's over 500,000. So if you took just the population of Asian Americans, just the population of Asian Americans in New York City, they would be the 10th largest city in the United States, right behind Dallas. And it's unfathomable to most people that you have this many people from one ethnicity with shared concerns that have never had a state senator or elected member of Congress from New York State. So I think this configuration is the best opportunity for those communities that have been traditionally divided, sliced and diced into numerous districts to finally have one representative to represent them in Congress. And the communities I'm talking about are Flushing, Bayside, Elmhurst, Briarwood, and Jamaica Hills. Especially, you know, Flushing is a unique neighborhood in Queens. It's really the center, the hub for culture, social gatherings, economic hub, numerous churches and religious organizations there. That is where the Asian American community is centered in Queens. And that is the community that's traditionally been divided. For the first time we're seeing now that community is being kept whole, and that's where we're seeing the opportunity now for someone like Grace Meng to be elected.
Andrew, how much did ethnicity always drives much of redistricting? Did it drive it as much this year, less this year?
Well, I think that where we are now with this Congress, the congressional lines were drawn by a Columbia University law prof who's a real expert, and he did a really excellent job. And it would be very nice if he got to finish his job and draw the state senate and, well, even the assembly lines. I don't think there's any chance that that's going to happen because, you know, they're very careful because you have to balance these things off. You balance race proportion with, you know, communities of interest, with making the districts reasonably compact. So you have to balance all these things off. And I think that the district in Queens, it's actually only about 30% Asian American, but I think the important thing is what the Democratic committee did, because if they put a strong Asian person in there and they can cross over, get people from across over, there probably will be an Asian representative coming out of Queens, and I think that'd be really terrific.
Let me ask, I want to ask both Lucia and Jerry this, is that when you, and I obviously have a bias in the sense that I'm working for Charlie Rangel, so everybody understands my bias.
Okay, it's not your fault.
But I mean, when you talk about Latino voters,
vacations in the
well,
Dominican
when you
Republic.
talk about Latino voters,
And his dad is Puerto Rican.
Yeah, he's rediscovered that. I think it's quite nice.
I'm going to let you make the arguments for him. When you talk about Latino voters, you're talking about Dominicans, you're talking about Puerto Ricans, you're talking about a growing Mexican community that probably hasn't reached citizenship numbers that really have as much impact. Similarly, with Asian American voters, I mean, Chinese voters, you know, we have Korean we have a Korean city council member, but these are not communities. You have tremendous South Asian, Indian Pakistani communities. Are these too broad category? Is Latino too broad a category?
Let's try
in this?
something.
Is Asian too broad a category?
Well, let's try something novel, right? Let's stop trying to think of ethnicity as the only vehicle for electing individuals that happen to be of that ethnicity or of a particular race. Reality is Black, Latinos, Asians, they've been electing white individuals in their districts for decades. Novel. That's not, I mean, that's typical for us. All of a sudden, Latinos want to exercise some muscle, happens to be a Dominican candidate in Washington Heights who wants to exercise a community's muscle and be able to say, hey, I can try and I can potentially challenge a four-term, a four-decade incumbent, regardless of race and ethnicity. Let's get down to the point here. The point is that you have white candidates running in Black and Latino neighborhoods for years, and we elect them all the time. What is wrong with Black or Latino or Asian candidates running in districts that, even though they're not majority, they still have a potential to be able to say there's leadership in our neighborhoods, we've come, we've risen, we have an opportunity to both register our individuals, go out there and exercise our rights at the polls, regardless of how many we have in numbers. Reality is all of a sudden you have communities that are organizing and getting a little savvy about who's making decisions and who's bringing food and who's bringing money into districts, and now we want to criticize that, or we want to begin to question.
No, I'm not criticizing. I'm trying to
possible.
analyze it. I'm trying to analyze
and
it.
I think it's possible. I mean, I think we have districts across the state where you have a Latino elected, Peter Lopez, up in some district in the Assembly upstate that has nilch of Latinos. You have a district up in Suffolk County in the county legislature, a county legislator, a female that has been elected in that district time after time, and she's Dominican in the Suffolk County legislature in a part that is majority white. I mean, there's nothing to be said about.
And you have a
That's right.
Dominican city council member representing a largely Puerto Rican neighborhood in Brooklyn, in Bushwick.
Well, also, when I drew the lines for West.
Well, I don't divide white people between Germans and Irish and Italians and Jewish, and I mean, I don't do that.
People, except some of those people do.
If I just jump in,
yes.
I think there are certain unifying factors that I'll speak just for the Asian American community, where there's a tremendous high percentage of immigrants that have issues with naturalization, language access, and just having that shared immigrant experience. There is a unifying factor there. However, we did not advocate, and we don't that all Asian Americans have the same concerns and are similar and should be grouped into the same districts. We submitted a community of interest report to LATFOR and to the court that detailed community by community the demographic makeup, socioeconomic status, the shared concerns of those communities, and only communities that we felt had similar concerns did we say should be grouped together. We didn't say group all the Asian Americans together. And just going on further, we didn't advocate for Asian American representatives. We asked only that those communities that have shared concerns be grouped together into one district so they can elect one candidate of their choice, whoever that is. We're nonpartisan. We don't endorse Rory Lansman, Grace Meng, whoever. At this point, we feel the job is done, the first step at least, in keeping the community whole.
It's an opportunity.
Yes. Now, whoever that community wants to elect, they can do it. And we're not saying it needs to be an Asian American or anybody else, but the first step needs to be taken, and that's keeping the community whole and together.
I mean, I think we've seen it, and again, I'm analyzing it. I'm not criticizing it.
No.
So, we've seen the same thing in Brooklyn, and in particular in Central Brooklyn, with the, Caribbean American community versus the American-born Black community, and now you have a growing African immigrant community, and it seems to me as a reporter for 21 years that, I grew up at a time when you talked about blacks, blacks, Hispanics, and whites, and it meant, and whites were this polyglot of various European nationalities. Hispanics meant Puerto Ricans. Blacks meant American.
You're showing
American.
your age now.
What's that?
You're showing your age now.
Well, I am showing my age, but life is more. I think life is much richer for it being much more complicated. I mean, this is not a criticism of that development.
But in Central Brooklyn, there are blacks of varied ethnicities. Within the Caribbean American, there are blacks of varied ethnicity.
Of various nationalities.
Yes, nationalities, and they consider that ethnicity. Ethnic groups. And there are also, as you've mentioned, a wide variety of continental Africans living in the Central Brooklyn area. This is not one group of people. African Americans, those folks whose families grew up in the South or moved north in the Great Migration, they share a common interest. The real question has been, with the major immigration of blacks from other areas of the world, can we all get along? And more importantly, are our interests parallel? Do we have communities of interest? What has really happened in Brooklyn, and I live in Brooklyn, is that there's been a merging of communities. It's no longer, this is a Caribbean American Jamaican community, and this is the Trini place, and then we have the African American Southern folks. No, folks are basically mixed in together. And what has come out of that is that they not only has community grown, but ties have grown.
And candidates have to appeal more broadly.
Candidates have to appeal more broadly, but I think even more significant than that is that the people on the ground, the people that live in those neighborhoods, have grown to know their neighbors and have grown to coalesce around issues that affect them all. When they start talking about cutting out post offices, when they start talking about, when they remove the supermarket from the neighborhood, closing, oh please, or putting another school into a fifth school into a building, all of those communities come out together and support each other because it's our children, it's our streets, it's our community. But that doesn't mean that there's still definition between the communities in terms of what their desires are, particularly around immigration issues, particularly around issues about getting a good education for children.
Now, in particular concerning the Dominican community and many of the Asian immigrants, I want to ask you this because you're the demographer in the bunch here. Voting always trails demography because of the question of citizenship. I mean, Puerto Ricans are citizens by birth.
Right.
A Puerto Rican can move here and immigration is not an issue. For a Dominican, for a Mexican, for a Salvadoran, for a Colombian, citizenship is, somebody who, I don't mean people of that descent, but people who are immigrants, that's an issue. So, I mean, is this a question of citizenship catching up with the demography?
Well, I think it's starting to catch up. I mean, you take, like Rangel's district, I think is about, if you look at citizenship of voting age, it's around 40% Latino, 30-something% African American. So it's actually not as Latino as the top line would lead you to expect. And the Asian community, often very low citizenship rates initially. Some of the Latino groups, like you're mentioning, Mexicans, I think they're very low citizenship rates. But the other thing that happens is that they have to be represented. I mean, they're there, whether or not they can vote. And so I think it's very important. And, we may have lost a little bit sight of, why there is a Voting Rights Act, why there's a Section 2. But, if you sit and divide districts up so that minority groups can't elect a candidate of their choice, that's really very, reprehensible, I would say. And frankly, I know you're saying, well, you think it's legal. You said in the promo.
I'm not expressing a support for it.
Judge Liff or perhaps Judge Roberts decided that this was legal, but in fact what they actually did was they deprived the downstate of if you're going to go to 63 seats, they deprived the downstate of at least one or two more Latino seats, potentially, if you breach the Queen's line, another African American seat. So basically, your friends in Albany, Bob,
very good.
came up with
Throw it on him.
You know me.
Came up with a way to deprive the minority community in the Senate of probably around 3 or 4 seats.
But that's because you can take the same 19 million people, and the way you divide them up.
That's why they have the Voting Rights Act.
You can create a 60-seat majority for Democrats in the state assembly, and you can create a 2-seat majority for the Republicans.
Well, another way to look at it is
state Senate. I mean, it's the power of map making.
No, but the other way to look at it is that the Republicans have for years and years and years have tried not to recognize the demographic changes that have occurred in New York, both the growth of downstate and the growth of various minority communities, because frankly, if you're a Republican, it's unlikely they're going to vote for you.
Unlikely you'll be black or Latino.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. And so, you know, so I think that, and I think we've seen now with the kind of experiment that happened in California, what would happen if you had, in effect, a fair redistricting. And what happened in California, and both parties screamed, but what happened in California is there are many fewer Republican seats in the Senate, the Assembly, whatever the equivalent of Senate, Assembly, and Congress than there was before this very nonpartisan, truly nonpartisan independent redistricting commission redistricting. But they're different Democrats. So a lot of incumbent Democrats, where they went and did all sorts of crazy stuff to keep them in power, are out. And I was on a couple of conference calls listening to them whine. And basically, that's what we should have had in New York. If we had that in New York, the Senate would be probably something on the order of 36, 24, 25, 26, depending on 27, what they put on the other side. And it would have huge effects for all of the services downstate, for CUNY, for the sorts of things Esmeralda was talking about, you know, schools, all the services, instead of the two big public works programs upstate, of course, are SUNY and prisons. And the running joke is that most upstate voters would prefer prisons to SUNY, because the difference between prisoners and SUNY students is that prisoners are locked up, whereas the SUNY students might come.
They run wild.
They might come into your town. They might even register and vote.
Thank you.
An issue that's very specific right now, just passed today in terms of the DREAM Fund. I mean, the DREAM Act, in terms of access to tuition aid programs, at the end of the day did not pass, or didn't even see the light of day of committee in the Senate in particular, because the reality is that the Republicans don't even want to talk about access to tuition aid for undocumented students. That is an issue in and of itself, that is an example that they will continue to manipulate, so that legislation that is positive for our communities and that things that we can coalesce around, because there's a huge coalition across all races and ethnicities, they cannot come together to actually pass legislation that will have a major impact on the students and the future of the state and the economy.
Well, I think
And let's keep clear, and we have our resident demographer here, that the growth in New York State, most of the growth in New York State has taken place in New York City.
In the
and
last
Long
2
Island.
decades.
Right.
That's right.
So the fact that the new Senate maps that have been that came out of the legislature and was signed by the governor, who would never sign, of course, signed by the governor, actually puts a quote a new district in
outside Albany, right?
Yeah, outside Albany.
Right? It's a Republican area outside Albany.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's really
exactly, and they make no bones about the fact that this is basically a white district. Instead of putting the district where the majority of the growth has occurred in New York State.
Well, that's one of the reasons I said that the scandal, I quoted Michael Kinsley, that the scandal is not what's illegal, the scandal is what's legal.
Well, but it's still being determined whether it's legal.
Exactly.
Well, that's right. I mean, but if I remember correctly, is when it went before the State Court of Appeals, they were very skeptical, at least in their questioning, that because this is a political, because this is essentially a political question, you have courts that are going to be reluctant to kind of stick their nose into what they perceive as another branch's internal operations.
But what the other thing is that court has to deal with is that their particular niche in all the courts in this country is the interpretation of the New York State Constitution. And that's what that case is about. So they may dodge the bullet. They may say it's too political, we don't want to get involved. But if they don't interpret the state constitution, who will? And we are hopeful that they grab that mantle and make a decision that's going to benefit the entire state. Because you want to know something? It is better to have a definitive answer about how to interpret the state constitution than every 10 years we don't know what's going to happen next. And that's what government is supposed to be about. People should know. All this secrecy, in case you don't know, that 63rd map did not come out until January. We went from June until January without them telling us that they were going to draw 60.
Didn't they
Because
go
they
from 61
refused.
to 62 10 years ago?
Yes, they
right.
did.
And this time they refused to follow the law and actually used prison-based, the actual adjusted data to count prisoners in their last known address. And they refused to put that data out and provide it until January along with their 63 district map. So some of us will stop and think, well, hey, you had prisoners, now they're brought back into New York City, so hey, let's increase one district and put it upstate because we lost that population that we've been manipulating for decades now. And using the prison-based population that's Black and Latino for its majority, and all of a sudden let's offset that by creating a white district in upstate.
You also have, I mean, there are communities that are protected under the Voting Rights Act, under civil rights laws, and in particular minority communities, specific African Americans, Latinos, and Asians. You've seen now in parts of kind of Western Brooklyn around Borough Park an attempt. You have this hugely growing Orthodox Jewish community, and they're explicitly trying to create an Orthodox Jewish dominated district. That doesn't have any legal protection. That's more of a pure political move, isn't it?
Yes, it has no legal protection at all.
And
The famous New York State law that protects Italians also doesn't apply to the federal in the federal statute. You know, the famous Italian protection law that requires CUNY to give affirmative action to Italian Americans because they've been so deprived.
Right. I forgot about that.
That doesn't
it doesn't apply to redistricting. But
It doesn't
we
apply
also
to
have
federal. It's not a federal law.
there may still be a problem because in trying to draw the Orthodox, let's be clear here, the Orthodox Hasidic Jewish district, they have to cross through areas of Brooklyn where there are huge Black and Latino population.
Mm-hmm.
So if they hurt us trying to get what they want, there will be a problem.
And at the end of the day, there's different ways of manipulating the numbers, right? I mean, in the Department of Justice found that a district that goes from Highbridge, Bronx, comes down to East Harlem, nitpicks at certain blocks in East Harlem that only picks up Latinos, and then goes into the Upper West Side to pick up I don't know who in between the 70s, 70th and Broadway over to Riverside, they consider that to be some type of community of interest district. And I'm thinking, okay, Yankee Stadium and, the Children's Museum in the Upper West Side. I mean, you have to stop and think about what that exactly. So there's different ways of manipulating. And at the end of the day, both Republicans and Democrats did a number on all our communities. They did a number, they negotiated it at midnight. The governor signed it after he said he would veto anything that looked,
like
shady, that looked like a partisan. And he did a number on all of us, and at the end of the day, he signed it, and they got what they wanted, and hopefully the courts will overturn that.
Go ahead.
You've been on the city redistricting commission,
Yes.
and next year we turn to 51 city council districts.
Well, actually, it's supposed to be this year.
Oh, this year, I'm sorry, this year.
I hope it's this year.
Next year, and it's a very different. It seems to me it's a very different process. There's a lot of the. It's not a perfect system, and it's a political. You can't take politics out of redistricting. That's kind of an
Well,
to me,
they
an absurd
consider
quality.
that commission. That's called the New York City Districting Commission. And I'm going to take a little liberty here. The only reason why the Voting Rights Act applies to New York City, 3 counties in New York City, is because of the massive amount of discrimination that had occurred upon Black people and Puerto Ricans, Latino folks, in New York City's history. So that's why New York City is covered by the Voting Rights Act that generally applies to the Deep South, where we all think about people riding around in hoods, etc. So this was up south in New York in regard to voting, and it's still up south in regard to voting. Now, going back to the question about New York City Districting Commission, I served on the first Districting Commission, quote, independent. There are 8 people appointed by the City Council, 7 people appointed by the mayor, and I want you to know that when I served, there was a very thin line regarding independence, okay? People were getting phone calls while we were meeting, telling them what they should be doing. So I don't know what's going to happen this time around. It has been very, very heavily controlled by both the council and the mayor. The good news is that it has to be diverse, particularly geographically diverse, covering all the boroughs. It has to be diverse regarding party. And they say they tried to mimic the population of New York City. They've never actually done that. Yeah, right. So We're going to see the names come out very, very soon on who the commissioners are going to be. And the real question is going to be, once again, are the commissioners people that came out of our communities, that know our communities, that have our community's interests at heart, or are these people that are representing the interests of the mayor and the city council?
But before we go to questions, just to kind of follow up on one of your points about California, is people, lawmakers will exploit redistricting and interpret it as incumbent protection, regardless of the race or the ethnicity of the district. That I mean, the classic example
They
is
call it continuity.
well, it's all, but there are very broad implications in my mind. You know, if you look at when Republicans all of a sudden became great champions of, in particular, black elected officials who wanted to pack as many black voters as possible into their district, and the result was, pardon the expression, to whiten the districts around those. And I've always believed that was key to the Republicans taking the House of Representatives in 1994.
That was their strategy.
They still do.
So it's exploiting. This is the politics of redistricting, saying I'm with you, and of course what you should be doing is holding onto your wallet when somebody like that comes to you and says, "So I'm not sure you can." You know,
can't take
too
off.
often it becomes incumbent protection rather than the kind of more open.
Well, no, but
let's all have a
incumbent
fight.
protection hurts minorities largely. It might help a few minority members if you pack, but it hurts minorities because if they're the growing group, they're not going to get their appropriate representation.
But you would think that the minority voters and all the voters from the district, if the elected official is good, we'll re-elect them.
Well, yeah, but if they draw it so 80%,
Are their
I
followers?
mean, I think the Bronx is very specific and very prime example. You have a district, an entire county that's over 50% Latino, I don't even know how much percent African American, but in its totality, it's majority minority county. I don't know how they found a way to squeeze this white district in there as much as they can, stretching out into Westchester. We thought it would be impossible for them to even fathom doing a bleach district, which they did, and originally it was to protect a Republican candidate that passed away 10 years ago, Guy Valala, and originally it was to protect a Republican.
after he was
white.
jailed.
But now we have a Democratic white incumbent, and yet they still found a way of going out of the way to protect white voters to pack them.
Well,
into
he's
those
voting
districts.
with the
I want to say,
Democrats.
but the flip side
He's
of
voting
this,
with the Republicans.
But the flip side of this argument about packing people into a district is what happened in Asian districts and what traditionally happened in many communities of color where they'd be divided up.
Well,
So I mean,
they would
That's
split us-
called
it's kind of
they're
a
cracking. They split us up like
Well,
a
both
pizza
of those
pie.
That's
things,
right.
both of those things could be illegal under the Voting Rights Act.
Exactly.
Because I've testified in cases where they could be illegal because
just
if they
confusion.
dilute minority voting strength by chopping up a minority group, putting it in 5 districts, then they've lost a seat. If they overpack minorities, let's say say you would have majorities in 3 or 4 districts, they pack them into 2. That's also of depriving them of
Assembly
voting rights.
District
That's what he was
72.
talking about in
Yeah.
our
Right,
budget.
absolutely.
Washington Heights,
Which they wouldn't do anything about.
Right, Washington Heights Assembly District,
72, 73, yeah.
Assemblyman Linares' district is over like 70, 80 some odd
Yeah, it's about 80%.
Latino, and when you look at the citizen voting age population, it's like 70% Latino, and yet the neighboring district,
It's like
which is,
20,
yeah,
30,
it's
yeah.
like,
Oh, it's ridiculous.
very, I mean, you would just give me 10%
of that, right?
and put it over, and it's not to elect the Latino, but it's to force the sitting incumbent to listen
To relate,
the
to
issues
to
of those
respond,
communities.
to
But
respond.
instead, the sitting incumbent, very smart, very savvy for decades, found a way to ensure that he don't have to do that. He don't have to.
But
listen.
see, but if
Complication.
that district was probably challengeable, and we've challenged one in Nassau, and it looks like they're willing to talk. So I mean, I think that district could have been challenged by Latino Justice Perldeff, and that was not.
Yes, sir. Tell us your name and your campus, please.
My name is John Moreno, and I am a Queens College sociology major.
One of ours.
Department chair.
Considering
It's a plant.
the overwhelming democratic demographic, mapping powers have granted Republicans a more significant representation. What we say to Republicans that if there was more fair representation in the mapping powers, that are afraid that they will lose proper representation from their representatives.
That if there was the question is if there was fair mapping, the Republicans would be behind the 8 ball.
Well, that's why the state Senate majority put $3 million aside to hire a very fine law firm, one of whose partners charges $775 an hour, to defend this concocted plan that they put forward. I mean, they know it's vulnerable. They wouldn't have to spend $3 million defending it.
It's your money, you know.
But it's also the case, I think, in particular in the case of the Asian community is not as overwhelmingly Democratic as as either an African American community or a Latino.
That's right. You know, there's 2 Asian American city council members, and one of them is Republican, who just recently switched to Democrat.
Right.
Oh,
But,
really?
yes, but that's
Peter Koo, right?
Yes, Peter Koo.
Right. One is a
They
Republican,
learned.
became a
They
Democrat.
learned.
And I just want to correct something earlier. That there is not a Korean American city council member. Kevin Kim ran for a city council
sorry.
seat in Bayside. It was a very ugly campaign.
That's right.
Against
Well,
Dan Halloran.
Against Dan Halloran. That's
and
right.
As the
I'm
Republican
sorry,
in
you're
a
right.
very Democratic area won the election.
Because that was an upset. But you have more partisan parity, closer to partisan parity within the Korean community, within the Asian American.
It's not as homogeneous as in some other racial groups, but we see in general. I mean, the people that are elected tend to be Democrats. But there are, certain Asian groups, especially, not so much here in New York City, but Vietnamese American community tends to vote Republican. So it's not homogeneous as it is in.
It's also the second generation trend much more Democrat. Because once they find out what the U.S. is like.
As you see, as you see with the Cuban community, as you see the past the.
Prime example.
Right, exactly.
Are you
Half Cuban.
So so you see that as a
Hartford,
much more that there's a much more democratic leaning. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, my name is Karin Quispe. I come from Peru, and I'm coming from Medgar College.
Yay!
My
Hold down the
question is,
cheering here.
what impact will congressional redistricting have on the 2012 races for the House of Representatives? Will Republicans maintain their majority, or will Democrats win back their House?
Well, it's true. I mean, we're in New York, so we're kind of, our parties are within the Democratic Party. But redistricting.
We may lose.
I mean, you had major Republican victories in legislative elections in 2010.
Well, we had Bob Turner, right?
You had Bob Turner, but Bob Turner was a very
Michael
specific.
Grimm.
They were very
Grimm.
specific. All elections are
Party.
idiosyncratic, and
Lived
that's
in his mother's
But
third floor
let's
apartment.
But
be
her-
real. The impact of this redistricting process on what it does to our electorate right now is going to be tremendous in the state of New York. I mean, the fact that you have a viable Dominican candidate in Washington Heights in and of itself is amazing. The fact that you have a viable and Democratic Party supported Asian American candidate in Queens is changing the landscape. So I think in both those, not just the first, but the reality that they can have a real viable campaign that is causing attention to our communities, that is amazing, because I think that in and of itself is going to allow our communities to actually be heard. Whoever wins will now have to pay attention to the issues that our communities have been yelling about for decades.
Well,
I actually want to address that question too, because I think it's an excellent question. Because people think about redistricting and they think about their state or their city. But the real thing is if you really do take a very broad scope and look at the entire United States, you realize that this is a chess game and that the various major parties are looking to gain one group, one man here, one woman here. And every time they do that, they recalculate how many people are in the House of Representatives. So it is going on across the country. That's why there was such a ruckus about the California redistricting, because the California has so many congressional members. So yes, we're myopic here because we're focusing on New York State. But a good thing to do for all of you is to take a good look about what the waves have been across the country, and as a result of redistricting, and I'll even say partisan redistricting, have Democrats held on to what they have Republicans held on to what they have, or has there been a major shift? And don't think that there's all of this shuffling going on for nothing. The same law firm that was talked about before, they're doing cases across the country,
Yeah,
redistricting cases, trying to tip the balance for their client.
right. And I think the Democrats are going to do better with this round than a lot of people thought, because they don't tend to realize that there have been the same similar population shifts all over the country, and a tremendous number of the plans are still in court.
Yeah, but I think that the Democrats are going to do well across the country because the Republicans have fallen off the deep end politically, and that
Well,
they're
that's
having a
another
very
reason.
that I mean that's kind of exists. It seems to me that the kind of politics of the Republican Party trapped by the hard right supersedes a lot of what we're discussing. I mean, there are things that are beyond acceptability to a majority of voters. At least I hope. So, pardon my having an opinion here. Yes, ma'am.
Good evening. My name is Maria Munive. I'm a public administration major from John Jay College. My question is, does the current redistricting scheme reveal unspoken tensions and between different ethnic communities in New York? And also how the current redistricting will affect gentrification?
Or how will gentrification affect redistricting?
redistricting.
Right. That's an interesting. That's an interesting question about gentrification. I mean, I know that we see a lot of the changing demographics in Congressman Rangel's district, who had a plurality Latino district for the last 10 years, and but a lot of the people who have come into the southern end of that district have been, I guess, most of them are white, but there's people of all ethnicities who have more money than the people
upwardly mobile folks.
than the people that they were replacing.
And that's why that district had to go to the Bronx. I mean, they chopped off that component that had continuously become more gentrified, and now it brought that community towards the Bronx across, because that's where the majority of the population had to move. The shift went to the Bronx because of housing stock and the reality that people's inability to pay the atrocious rents in Washington Heights have begun to move into the Bronx. But I just want to say, I mean, about the race and ethnic and the divisions and all those, the fighting, I think it's overrated. I think people loves, to talk about the sensational aspect of things. I think the reality is that this is what democracy looks like. This is what democracy should be looking like. Candidates should be running, and we should be exercising our ability to cast a ballot at the polls and let the voters decide on who the best candidate is. And we should not be just thinking about, racial and ethnic divides and whether, the reality is if candidates are going to do the division, the reality is that there's a much broader problem on the base. And it can't be the candidates that are causing that division. That's probably a much broader conversation.
And even more significant than that, this is the first redistricting round, and I have to say it's my fourth, where we actually had civil rights groups from the Latino community, the Asian community, and the Black community come together and draw maps together that respected each other's community. And we call those maps the unity maps. And I've done quite a bit of work with the folks around this table because it took quite a bit of work to come to an agreement. And when we did that, there was shaking in the city because they had depended upon dividing and conquer. They had depended upon it. So I'm proud of the work we've done this time. I hope we can go forward with it because we still have the city council to handle.
Well, also the court's master, personally, he took very seriously the unity map. He really, truly did. And he actually dismissed all the political maps. This is for Congress, because he said, well, they're just partisan. And he also dismissed all the one district maps, like the Esmeralda, triple play, the three borough map. He dismissed the NAACP. Let's go up to Mount Vernon map.
Now there was up to
so I thought, so he did a really excellent job, and he's as close as you could get to nonpartisan redistricting. So if he did it to the state senate, New York will be changed forever.
I just wanted to add real quick, so far, we worked with community groups to develop these unity maps.
Right.
And it's great to hear now, after the congressional maps were completed, I'm getting calls from these same community groups saying, we're getting calls from people that are involved in this race in Congressional District 6, which is the one Grace Meng's running in, asking us for input from the community. Right. And this would never have happened before when, the Asian American community was a 10th or a 5th or less of a district. Now that they're almost 40% of this congressional district, everybody who's seriously considering running for that seat has to find out what do the Asian American community, what do they want? And it's the first time we're getting calls like
Fantastic.
this, and it's great to hear. And that's what redistricting is about. Because if you're not, a significant part of that district, the people who are running for it or who eventually get elected don't care about your community.
Just to stay on the congressional election for a second, we have, it's not only the main district and the Wrangell district that are of interest. You have some very interesting races in Brooklyn in particular. I mean, you had a generational challenge by Hakeem Jeffries, Assemblyman Jeffries, that essentially drove a longtime incumbent, Ed Towns, to decide he just didn't want to run.
Well, Ed's pretty old. I mean,
If it was age we're talking about, we should have
as
some
is
other
Charlie,
resignations.
as is Louise Slaughter. I
But
mean,
you
as
also
is Vita
have,
Lowy.
but you also have a challenge to Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez, who, by a city council member named Eric Malave Delan, which is essentially a power struggle around Assemblyman Vito Lopez's leadership of the Brooklyn Democratic.
Who's not Latino?
The Brooklyn Democratic.
Checking.
The Brooklyn Democratic Party broadly, and also within his power base in northern Brooklyn. So I mean, you have these races in which, you'd be hard pressed to argue ethnicity is an issue. It's either generational or it's plain old fashioned power politics.
You have a non-Latino manipulating a Latino candidate to run against another long-term incumbent Latino candidate. I mean,
And then
there's
he
some level.
also put in a white candidate.
I think that's
to draw off
democracy
the white
too.
vote.
Hey, I mean, if you can have two viable candidates fighting for, a population's vote, then hey, that's what democracy should look like. Unfortunately, in that area, I won't possibly say that is exactly the case, especially when a non-Latino is there's power. I mean, it's political machinery at this stage right now that we're talking about. So I think one of the things that we haven't talked about is something like Crowley's district in Queens, where now Latinos in the past were divided between the southern, for those that are in Queens, the southern portion of Corona and the northern portion of Corona. They're now all wholly contained within Crowley's district, which should be significant. I mean, obviously, the Queens Democratic Party did not say, hey, let's put a Latino to run, because Crowley's the chair of the Queens Democratic Party. But essentially what we do see is an opportunity for, again, something similar to happen, where now you're going to have the chair of the Democratic Party, the congressman of that district, representing a huge number of Latinos that have a senator, have an assembly person, and have a city council person.
But just the way those, the Latino voters in that part of Queens can make a judgment that says, Joe Crowley has a lot of seniority. He's the county chair. He can serve me best,
right,
which is the same argument that Wrangell is making to people who have supported him in Washington Heights for a long time, and to people in East Harlem, and now to the people in the Bronx, is that your best interests are not necessarily served by somebody of the same color, ethnicity, however you want to look at it. But it's that. So, I would politics
say there's a major difference.
Politics is a variety. There's a variety of factors.
There's a major difference there. One, the community was split. In Washington Heights, the community has never been split. It's always been wholly contained within Congressman Wrangell's district. And now it just increased by going to the Bronx. In Crowley's district, the community was split between Ackerman and Crowley. And the fact that now that community is unified allows that community to now begin to speak as a voice, as a collective, and immigrant populations across, because there's diverse immigrant populations now, Asian communities that were south of Corona line, north of Corona line. I mean, the reality is that two different scenarios. Upper Manhattan has been Latino for a very long time, was a majority Latino 10 years ago. There's like a little waiting game. People are saying, give him 2 more years and then he'll step down. I mean, there's a lot more and very different politics going on in those two scenarios than to make a comparison. It's like apples and pears, comparing the two.
Apples and avocado.
Fruit salad, yes, ma'am.
Hello, my name is Mana Sabori. I am from Queens College, and I'm a political science major. And my question is, do you believe Bob Turner's district will have another Republican representative?
No.
No.
I think that what happened with Bob Turner is that basically people voted against David Weprin and for Ed Koch. So, that had, elections are very, they all have, when an election gets a lot of attention, and that was a special election. Yeah. So you had, whatever political focus there was on that particular election, including the rather spectacular way in which the former incumbent, Anthony Weiner, flamed out and lost his seat. and the former tabloid reporter in me actually, you know, I'm a big fan of Anthony Weiner's, and that was bizarre enough.
maybe
But
they'll
there
have a
you
talk show
had,
soon.
but there you had, you know, you had a particular set of factors. One of the things about this city, and the reason that organization is so powerful, is because you go into any other city in the country, you got one congressman represents that whole city, and you know even state legislative elections become much more important. Here we have something like 12 members, you know, representing pieces of New York City, and there's no coverage in the media of those elections. And so the kind of grassroots stuff that you all are talking about becomes that much more important. And I believe that money is actually less important in a New York City election than it is elsewhere in the country, because nobody's going to buy TV ads if you've got 1/12 of the city. You're not going to buy an entire, you know, so our politics is very, so, you know, the role of the media, being the former reporter, is very different, whereas Bob Turner's election had all the focus because it was the only game in town. So, yes, sir.
Good evening. My name is Daniel Osei. I'm from the Graduate School of Brooklyn College, and I also would like to know what does redistricting look like today versus 10 or 20 years ago, and can 2 or more people attack that question?
4 years.
The good
4
news,
decades ago.
yeah, right, exactly, I have the age, right? The good news is that today, people of color who make up the majority of New York City have actually grabbed redistricting and are not letting other people do the redistricting manipulations for them. We're doing it for ourselves. So that's a big difference. Before, there would be some friendly big brother, like you talked about before that, put their hand around your shoulder and told you this is the best way to go. And there was a lot of fighting that went on because some people wanted to do independent redistricting within their own community. The other difference is that 10 years ago, there was still a lot of tension in the state legislature about whether Republicans were going to lose control of the state legislature. That continues today, but it's even more of a tension because they only have a very, very small majority. So that's why we see all these manipulations going on regarding the state Senate.
And we have a lot more people of color now, both in the Assembly and the Senate, who are trying to protect their seats too, as well as, you know, incumbents who there's a certain level of incumbency protection, as well as within the leadership, right? So
we only have 5 minutes. Let me ask you a question. The exact arguments that they're making about this heightened voice of, you know, you got 3 members who helped put together this unity map. How important is it to have a structural reform? The kind of independent, I mean, they're exerting political power. Right. And so does that political power that they're talking about, just as they get to exert that political power, is it threatened?
Well, I don't think, I think the unity map is a very nice map. But the reality is that the closest thing that was actually put into place from the unity map was put into place by the court. The other 2 maps don't really look very much like the unity map. I mean, Esmeralda, Louise, and Jerry would not have drawn the Senate or the Assembly the way they drew it. And I mean, and just what you were saying about District 72, there's a similar thing out in Nassau County where they packed a black district and, you know, diluted the one next door. And so
but the question
but they
they're
didn't
exerting
have the power.
political power.
No, but they don't. They're not, because they didn't control redistricting. They control, you know, the thing that's powerful about the unity thing is they're opposing in a united way the state Senate and Assembly maps. And they opposed, well, as Esmeralda said, no map from the Congress. But they, you know, if we got into a position where Pursley was drawing the Senate and the Assembly, I think then the unity map would come into play, because they would have tremendous power there in that forum in the federal court, not in the state court, but in the federal court, because the federal court is obligated to look at minority voting rights.
But I am listening to the level of threat, because at the end of the day, a lot of the fight and a lot of the struggle amongst civil rights groups and good government, we call them good government white groups, at the end of the day was all of a sudden we learned the damn game. We've figured out the power plays. We have leadership in both the House and the Assembly, the Senate and the Assembly. And all of a sudden, you're going to come in and you want to change the rules.
And make it an independent.
Yeah, and then who do you talk to about that?
And
you
who
have
gets
a
appointed?
conversation with me
Exactly
about
the
that.
point I'm
Did you
making.
ask and who gets appointed and who's in the table making the deal? And guess who was at the table cutting the deals with Cuomo last minute, ramming it through? Not people of color. Not
Daddy.
good, not civil rights groups, good government white groups. At the end of the day,
Well, not all of them.
came to save the day and help us through, navigate the system of, help us into happy land. And at the end of the day, we know what we need, and that's not what we need.
As a white person, you have to exclude.
Speaking on behalf of white
Common
Common Cause was not part of that.
Common Cause and NYPIRG went
government.
the other way. And
Right,
in fact,
exactly. Not all of them, not all.
So you even.
It's always a sector.
Let me just grab, we only have about a minute and a half left. Let me grab a quick question, please.
Sure. My name is Alexandra Ruiz. I'm a history graduate student from Queens College. And I think you guys started to answer my question, but I will elaborate. Will any independent redistricting commission really be nonpartisan? Or will the political parties in New York still be in control
Right.
of the process?
I mean, and is there a difference between partisan and politics? I mean, can you do politics without being partisan? It's a pretty broad question, isn't
Well,
it?
and what they pass in the legislature basically says that if the legislature doesn't like what this supposed quasi-independent group comes up with, they can then draw it themselves. So is it really an independent commission that they passed?
Well, it's a
Find out.
bipartisan commission. It's not a nonpartisan commission.
bipartisan
It's basically entrenching the current system of having the two parties draw the lines.
And just across the river in New Jersey, there's a bipartisan commission with the supposed independent member, and we see what, it assumes that there's only Democrats and Republicans throughout the entire state when there's all these other party structures, and what happens to third parties and people like the working families parties or individuals that are not registered within a party. What happens to the voice, their voice when it comes to
I guess the question is, is independent really independent?
Thank you.
And
Can it be independent?
Yeah.
Should it be independent?
Yeah, and-
should you take politics
well,
out
I'll
of
tell
this?
you, ALDEF, we didn't take a position on this because it is a very complicated issue. It would be great if it really was independent. If it could be independent, that's a different issue. But
Take
I
the
don't
last.
think
got 30
I
seconds.
think there's no such thing as an independent commission, but that doesn't mean that the New York State redistricting process does not need to be reformed. It's a farce right now. We need to have a commission and folks who are looking out for the people of New York and really not just for the incumbents.
And
I
there
should
needs to
mention
be a broad
member of
conversation.
a member of the redistricting commission called it a farce.
I just got the goodbye sign. I always make deadline, and thank you all. This was very spirited. We'll see you next time on CUNY Forum. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sit still.